Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Talking TWAMPs, which I will remind you is a production of William & Mary Podcasting Network. Today, we are going to be talking about a topic that is, at the point of recording, fairly relevant, but ought to be relevant to U.S. and international policy year-round. But first, before we get into what that topic it is, my name is Blake Phillips, and I'll be your host for this episode. I'm going to throw it over to the person nearest to me, which ought to be at this point, Abe.
Okay, so hi, I'm Abe. What else do you want me to say? I'm a government economics double major, and I'm dead inside. There we go.
Jeez.
Oh boy.
Next nearest ought to be William.
Yep, that Nova kid. All right, I am William Moore. I am a government and economics major, headed into France in the near-ish future. And I call people and beg them for money for my job, so
nice.
That's fun.
And Joe.
Hi, I'm Joe. I'm an international relations major with a focus on Russia and post-Soviet studies, and I am about as far away from Nova as you can possibly get without going into the Southern Hemisphere.
You know, we need to look that up one of these days.
Nice place.
Yeah. All right. So as I said, today's topic is internationally flavored, but is extremely relevant to U.S. policy and has been since basically the end of World War II, and that is NATO. So for a little bit of background, as of this recording, Donald Trump has about 24 hours ago left a NATO summit being held. Anyone remember where they held this one?
Well, it was not in Helsinki, I can tell you that.
No.
Because that's where he's going.
In some major European city.
Isn't he in
Brussels,
England?
wasn't it?
Oh.
Sorry?
Brussels, I thought.
I want to say it was Brussels. Yeah, I want to say it was a Benelux city. So he has just, as of about 24 hours ago, left Brussels. And it was a rocky
Way to
meeting.
date us.
Wait,
to be sure.
Wasn't he in England yesterday?
Oh, he made that skip trip, didn't he? So it was about 72 hours ago then that he left Brussels. Good call, Abe. So about 72 hours ago he left Brussels, and it was a rough meeting. They had a couple of emergency sessions for some discussions. There was some pundits leading into it that were saying things as wild as Donald Trump may even call for the dissolution of NATO. So one of the things I'd like to talk about, how well did it go? Anybody want to chime in on how well they think it actually went?
Better than I expected.
Yeah, I'm going to concur with Joe there. President Trump has been pretty critical of NATO for quite some time, including during his campaign leading up to presidency, always basically calling out NATO members on not paying what he always describes as their fair share, saying that the U.S. pays way too much for the defense of the alliance and things of that nature. And I mean, he wasn't exactly wrong in that sense. Many NATO members actually don't fulfill the requirement, which is 2% of the, well, there's speculation because of this meeting that they're going to raise it, or did they actually? I can't remember. But it was 2% leading up to that. And many NATO members did not pay the 2% of their GDP to their military expenditures like the NATO treaty implied, whereas the U.S. whereas the U.S. paid more than that. So he wasn't wrong in that regard. And since they want to expand effectively the budget of NATO by having more nations pay, I think it went pretty well, all things considered. NATO should be stronger after this meeting, one would think, at least.
So, William, that's a pretty positive uptick. Abe, your take?
Oh, my take? Okay. I'm prepared for this.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
Joe, how about you?
Go to Joe.
I think that in principle, it makes sense for the U.S. to pressure other nations to start spending more, especially with the increasing threat from Russia. However, I think the way that Trump went about it was counterproductive. Let's say the obvious and say that Trump is not very popular in much of Europe, and especially in Germany, which is the center of all this. Realistically, the only country that could really make a significant difference in the strength of the alliance by raising its military spending from, 1.5%?
1.2.
Yeah, 1.2% up to that 2% or even higher. The problem is, And there was talk about this. I read an article on War of the Rocks, I think. I'll try to send it to you for the link dump if I can find it, which said that the German military, even before this, was in serious need of a budget increase, and there were people in Germany already talking about it. The problem is, because German voters don't like Trump, now that Trump has very publicly and very rudely demanded it, the German government's kind of in a dilemma, isn't it? Because if they raise the funding now, the opposition in the next election is going to say they folded to Trump. And that's not going to be a good look for them. But then again, at the same time, they're facing increasing pressures, both internally and externally, to actually raise it. So I think this is one of many examples in which Trump's aggressive negotiation style has been counterproductive to actually achieving his goals.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to snatch at that German bait that was just dangled in front of me. For those listeners who don't know, I'm a German major. But
why not? If you know your tell us. Am I wrong?
No, I mean, you're not. In fact, the only counterpoint that I might offer, and briefly, is that the German government for a long time now has recognized this need to increase defense spending. They've actually been banking on their increased defense spending taking place in the EU. Several generations now of German politicians have attempted some sort of EU joint military, not necessarily in the sense of an EU-owned military, but soldiers that are not necessarily the German soldiers that would, for instance, patrol the Czech border or something to that end. Nothing, a little bit less domestically tied. So that money still might be able to happen. They might not be as much of a dagger in the back of potential elections. It may just not be able to happen directly in terms of German military defense spending without a little bit of cloak and dagger sort of EU molding going on there. But I'd like to sort of zoom that out a little bit. I know William, especially going to France, having taken some French courses, might be able to offer a little bit of perspective here. But just anybody who wants to jump in, especially Joe with nations that are looking to join the EU or have been petitioning to join the EU for some time, or just enter any other Eastern Bloc EU nations. What's the sort of reception to this? As many of you mentioned, Donald Trump called an emergency meeting at NATO to discuss jumping, not only meeting the 2% extant goal, but jumping the NATO contribution expected level to 4% of nations' GDP by 2050. That vote failed. They did not adopt that 4% benchmark. But he wasn't really alone. A lot of leaders were reluctantly, at least behind closed doors, as people are reporting, recognizing this need for increased spending. What nations kind of fell where, and are there any nations that look like they might comply with this request?
So I can lead with France because France is an interesting topic when it comes to NATO, because way back in the day during the Cold War, France actually withdrew from NATO under President de Gaulle, which was a very big deal and didn't, I think, really fully reintegrate into the alliance until 2004. So France has always been a interesting position for NATO. And what's interesting is that France might be one of the few countries, in my opinion, that might actually comply with what President Trump is suggesting, which I think would be fascinating to see, because we have a President Macron who has recently reintroduced mandatory military service or mandatory national service into France, and is really promoting a very, I don't want to say nationalistic, but a much more regimented concept of the French government as it has existed, and might very well just say, you know what, might as well increase the military spending because we have to. I don't know how likely that is, and there might be a lot of blowback in France, because there's been a bit of blowback as of late because of his a little bit more pro-military tact that he's been taking. But he might actually be one of the countries to really agree with President Trump in this regard, which would be interesting, to say the least.
Anybody want to offer any other national perspectives?
I think I can speak to some extent for the Eastern Bloc. These countries, which are actually close to the threat at hand, which we won't mention overtly right now, are obviously much more in favor of NATO. I guess the quintessential example is Poland, which is having a little bit of that sort of anti-globalist populism going on right now. Bit. But support for NATO remains at about 84%, which is much higher than in other countries where that sort of thing's been going on. The same is true of the Baltic states. I think many of them would be happy if everybody in NATO started spending 4%. But the point is, they all strongly prefer a united alliance, which doesn't always make that standard, than a fractious alliance, which is trying to. And that's why a lot of these Eastern Bloc countries are really not happy with the way that the summit went, not happy with the way that, well, I'll just go out and say it, with the way that Trump is talking about NATO. Obviously, what he says can't always be taken at face value, but he's gone off a lot about the alliance being obsolete, about how the Europeans are ripping us off, even bringing up the idea of withdrawal. And the scary part is that this is having an effect on domestic politics. I believe I sent you all a poll in which it showed that the percentage of Republicans who support NATO membership is down to 47%, and 38% of Republicans are now in favor of withdrawal from NATO, which is almost a 15% increase from Trump's entry into office. So this you can imagine, like, Estonia is growing increasingly nervous about the coherence of the alliance going forward.
Yeah, and looking at that, it's interesting coming at a time where Russia is a growing threat, and Joe, I really hope I didn't put you in harm's way there by mentioning Russia, but where Russia is a growing threat, both in Europe and also globally. We all know the whole election debacle 2016 and Russia's continued interference in U.S. politics. It's interesting that the U.S. would be more desirous to back out now when Russia is a growing threat, as opposed to years ago when Russia was looked to be on the decline. And it's also interesting coming at the time of Trump's, summit with Putin, which has implications of its own, and the relationship between this divisive rhetoric over NATO and Trump's seeming warmness to the Russian leaders.
Well, what I think is also important to note is that, yes, while President Trump has been very critical of NATO and even talking about this, which is making many of our allies nervous, the Senate and the House have been pretty clear about their support for NATO. I think it was the Senate voted very recently, I think earlier this week, that reaffirming American support for NATO, and by like a huge margin. I think like 97.
I think it was almost it was almost unanimity. Maybe one or two votes off.
Yeah.
And there's expectation that I think the House is going to do the same. And the American legislative part of the government has made it very clear that NATO is absolutely indispensable to national security. So, yeah, there's concern, I have to imagine, but the reality of the situation is America isn't leaving NATO anytime soon. The House and Senate are making that pretty damn clear.
So let's talk a little bit, if that's not fully played out, about how this new Republican, new right-wing stance on NATO in America might affect our relationship and our willingness to act on behalf of NATO. Just a little bit more background. The only time that NATO's Article 5, which is the article that allows any member nation to trigger a defense policy, has ever been triggered, was actually by America in 2005 when they triggered it against, or maybe 2001, when they triggered it
9/11.
against, exactly, when they triggered it after 9/11. calling a massive European coalition in against the Middle East. So never actually against
which
Russia,
which
France ignored. Yes, it did, because it was not a fully integrated member. Lucky France. But there's an interesting set of remarks made just prior to the NATO meeting by the Estonian president, that with the help of U.S. and NATO backing, they are prepared to fight Russia to the last man, and that the past 5 years have indicated to Estonia that may need to be a thing that happens, especially after the Ukrainian contingency. Now, a part of our discussion can be whether or not that's a likely occurrence. But one more thing I'd like to throw in there, and the big thing I think is interesting to discuss, is how likely is the U.S. actually to engage in that? It's a discussion that's happened since NATO's invention, but how likely is the U.S. actually to come to the Estonia's aid? We have this rising sentiment among Republicans that it's not even worth being in NATO, let alone backing it. But and I'm definitely going to butcher this, so Joe, I do apologize. But in the Estonian capital, which Tallinn. Yeah, Tallinn.
But you were close.
In its capital, there's a yearly NATO parade, and this past year was the first time that U.S. Artillery was actually a part of that parade. So there's kind of a schizophrenic message here. The Trump administration is actively putting more U.S. hardware into shows of force in that bloc, but they're also saying that maybe NATO's not worth our time and money anymore. So I guess
the divide. Isn't this the divide we've seen continually through the administration, that Trump's public statements are pretty much separate from what the secretariat and what the government as a whole is doing underneath? I would not be surprised if Mattis and Trump are almost completely unplugged with each other as far as policy goes.
So that's a great place to sort of start off that conversation. Which of these two signals can we trust? I guess what I'm saying here is, if Russia were to roll into Estonia tomorrow, and war declaration is an entirely different thing than just putting tanks in the streets of Tallinn, would we uphold our NATO requirements?
Well, there's always been the concern that the U.S. won't actually get involved if Russia and priorly the Soviets, which was really when NATO was about, would have invaded. I mean, the point of our boys in blue, or I guess our boys in green because it's army, in West Germany, back in the 50s and 60s, wasn't actually to stop a Russian invasion. It was just to get America all riled up that, they killed our boys, we have to go in and fight. So I think public opinion would very quickly change if Russian troops started shooting on U.S. troops, because suddenly it's no longer just they're invading a foreign country that's like we have an interest in, but no Americans were really hurt. Suddenly it's they're attacking our boys. Something has to change. So I think by placing U.S. artillery pieces and troops in these threatened countries, we're really making a much stronger statement than anything the president can say. Because we have to keep in mind, this has been the president's approach to just doing politics. And I'm not saying it's a good thing, but it's how he's doing it, keeping his potential political adversaries on their toes. And unfortunately, he sees our allies as political adversaries, but he is using that tactic to keep them on edge, I would have to imagine.
That's definitively true. But I'd also like to offer, and I don't know, I believe one way or another on this, but I'd like to offer a counterexample that not too long ago, several U.S. citizens were shot down in a commercial flight over Ukraine that killed, I think it was either 2 or 3 U.S. citizens. Who were not soldiers, but was definitively linked to, if not the Russian government, then at the very least weapons willingly provided to pro-Russian separatists. And we're not at war right now. In fact, if anything, our rhetoric has toned down on Russia. Abe, what do you think? If Russia were to invade a NATO nation right now, would we react? How long would it take us to react? Would we wait until public opinion said yes? What do you think?
I think, well, since the Senate is in approval of NATO, I think it would be a lot easier to sway right now. The only concern is, of course, Trump and the public opinion, which is down. And, of course, the House isn't in charge of declaring wars, but the House has a big, is very susceptible to public opinion, and would also have a big, but would likely have a larger push against it. The thing I'm most concerned about is Mattis. I've read a little bit. There are just rumors going about that he's, if not on the outs, definitely losing his sway, at least in Trump's inner circle. And if that continues, and Mattis ends up going the way so many other secretaries have, we could easily see someone put in that is much more aligned with Trump's views on NATO and the isolationism going on there. And I think it'd be a lot less likely in the future that we would see those displays of U.S. force and U.S. artillery in Estonia if Mattis ends up going. So I think Mattis and the Senate are the key to our response to any invasion.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
keep going, Ed.
And so if either of those changes, we have the 2016 election, or the 2018 election, how that goes, and if Mattis continues to get pushed out, either of those are going to have a large shift in whether or not we respond.
So, Joe, the consensus here seems to be that we would get engaged, at least at some level. Maybe if Mattis or the Senate shifts, that might change. But by and large, it seems like the consensus is that we would get involved. Joe, do you have any sense, especially in your experience of U.S.-Russia relations, about what our goal would be in our involvement? Whether or not it would be to push back against Russia, to weaken Russia, and this is just to close out this line of speculation, or whether or not we'd be looking much more at a sort of quick as possible ceasefire.
Are you talking about conventional war with Russia?
So I don't know. This is your ball. Play with it.
So this is the worst kept secret in the NATO Alliance, and this is NATO has no ability whatsoever to defend the Baltic states. From what I've read, like the optimistic projection is that we could hold under a full mobilization scenario, assuming every nation in the alliance is whole hogging it, we could maybe hold the Russians for a month or two before they totally overrun the Baltic states and make it to the Polish border. At that point, the problem is we're dealing with rollback, which requires a massive offensive. At that point, you're dealing with full-on conventional war, which is why those barrier troops are so important. Really, the only way that we're going to be able to defend those countries is deterrence, basically nuclear deterrence. So it's really hard to say. It's really hard to say what we would do in that situation. And I think the whole point of NATO is less that we are actually actively preparing to fight World War III and more as a deterrent factor. I think that's the important thing here.
Fair enough. All right, so let's pivot off
Joe,
of...
I'm sorry, I just want to return to Joe's thing. So you don't think that even in a full mobilization, I mean, I'm sorry, Russia's military forces, while powerful, are certainly nowhere near the match for NATO's. I mean, Russia's just not what it used to be. It has a smaller population than the United States. Its military hardware is, while getting modernized, most of it is pretty old.
That's true, but there are two factors which play into this. The first is Russia's army is larger than the armies of the states that are nearby. Russia has universal conscription, which we don't. We have a professional army. And Russia has invested much more into ground forces than we have. Russia has more tanks than we do. I believe Russia has more tanks than the entire NATO alliance put together. Granted, a lot of them are T-80s, but the point is that's how they've decided to put their forces together, whereas we've spent a lot of money on really advanced fighter jets and such. And the second issue is quite simply geography and deployment. I think the idea was it would take a month or so under best case scenarios to deploy a division of U.S. troops from Kaunas to Europe and then further to get them east. And the idea is what we have in the Baltic states, plus what the Baltic states have, plus whatever local European forces could send in enough time, would be no match for the Russian military. Sure, I mean, if you took all of our forces and put them next to each other on a field, the Russians are outmatched. But the point is the Russians are right there and we're on the wrong side of the world. And the Germans aren't spending on their military.
And I think that brings up kind of an interesting point. I think for a lack of better terminology, the Russians could easily blitzkrieg the Eastern Bloc relatively easily. It would take too much time to get enough forces out. And sure, we could fight them back, but you also have to consider the U.S. especially has plenty of troops deployed Korea, the Middle East, and that's where a lot of our focus is. And so having to not only take our troops out of that area and move them to Europe, but that would also lead to a lot of destabilization in those areas where we have those troops. And so I think there's a lot of implication of, I don't think the U.S. would be capable of defending, at the very least, while maintaining peace peace is a relative term, while maintaining our status in the areas that we're currently in.
I think you guys underestimate the power of U.S. air power, but I don't know enough about that to really make a cohesive counter argument. I just have to imagine our air power would certainly, because we dominate the air. The U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy are the two largest air forces. I think we could stop a Russian advance just by virtue of blowing them up from the sky. But I don't know.
Tough call, and hopefully a call that never needs to get made. I'd like to pivot just real quick from this, elephant in the room possibility to the larger implications of the NATO discussions we've just had. So we've talked just briefly about how this is affecting the NATO countries domestically. Let's talk about other U.S. alliances and then just U.S. diplomacy as a part of this. One of the big things that a lot of people are talking about now is trust. Whether or not what Trump has said is coherent, whether or not his threats are something he's going to make good on, a lot of this seems to be harming international trust in the U.S.'s word in terms of treaties and allies and who likes who. So within NATO, but even beyond NATO, talking about things like Japan and South Korea and other key strategic allies. In fact, not that this is unprecedented, but it is a little alarming. Benjamin Netanyahu is scheduled to meet with President Putin to discuss potentially strategic defense in the Middle East. What does all of this mean for U.S. security alliances and structures worldwide? The rhetoric he's using, the threats he's making, the discussions he's having.
I think what we're looking at is incredibly unique. In the U.S., which has usually had this huge leadership role in whatever organization, like besides the EU, the U.S. has been the leading power in pretty much every international alliance and in every big thing, the UN, NATO. And so the U.S. is this big kind of peacekeeping power, and this shift into this isolationist and divisive rhetoric, I think, is obviously decaying that trust in us, in the U.S., because I think a lot of countries are starting to think they can't rely on us. So I think the EU will become more powerful, will have to become more powerful, and I think that it will embolden countries who may have beef with U.S. allies, because like North Korea versus South Korea, there's obviously the Korea summit that happened last month, the effectiveness being negligible so far. But if the U.S. continues to ramp up this isolationist rhetoric and continues to push further away from South Korea, that could embolden North Korea to take a more aggressive strategy towards the South. And so I think overall it's incredibly destructive. I also think it's its uniqueness since the founding of the United Nations. We haven't seen a all-out conflict between these global powers that we have. And I think it'd be very interesting to see how that dynamic would play out if the U.S. were to go to war with Russia or China, who are these huge powers that are hugely influential in the United Nations, and just how that would look in the terms of international relations would be very, think about the International Space Station, where you have citizens from all these different countries peacefully up there, and if these countries were to go to war together, I mean, that would be, I don't know what would happen. That would be incredible, because they're so isolated from Earth.
So Abe, you touched on this idea that the EU is going to get more significant in terms of filling that defense vacuum. Joe and William, I'd like to sort of put that to you then. So if we are seeing a breakdown in U.S. Strategic relations, are there other countries that are stepping in to fill those vacuums?
So I want to say yes in a certain way and no in a certain way, which is a really unhelpful answer.
That's fine.
Here's what I'm going to say. The EU, while it is economically very powerful, what makes the US just so unbelievable is that it had this network that it has built up since the end of the Second World War. And nobody else can really rival it so easily. European help, no matter what two ways you slice it, still has this tinge of colonialism in most former places. And while the US might not be liked, it doesn't have the same tinge to it. Many nations just don't have the power that are U.S. allies to really be the global projection that the U.S. is. I mean, take Japan, for instance. Japan, sure, economically powerful, but it really can't project its power much beyond its immediate seas around it. Whereas the U.S., it has troops everywhere. And I also want to slide back a little bit to what Abe said about this being unprecedented. I do agree in certain aspects it's unprecedented, but I think overall it actually spells a lot towards how the U.S. acted at the conclusion of the First World War and then moving on, where the U.S. was party to many major international agreements, the original creation of the League of Nations, the creation of certain economic treaties, and then just suddenly withdrew when the U.S. decided to become isolationist after the conclusion. That really withered a lot of trust in the U.S., which eventually led to the belief that the U.S. was not a strong country, which we had to show that was simply not the case through war.
Had to.
Yeah, well, I mean, okay, take your opinion what it is. The war was brought on us by Japan. No two ways about that.
No. I'm not saying we shouldn't join World War II. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying it's an interesting way to phrase it that we had to show that.
Well, I mean, take it how you will, but we had to show it by consequence of going to war.
So there's the answer to that question. War, huh? What is it good for?
Yeah, war.
Showing that you're a powerful country.
It's an effective strategy.
All right, Joe. So we've got it from William. EU's rich. It might be pumping more money into some of these structures, but ultimately not forming its own independent strategic deals. Are there any other major regional players that are stepping in to create strategic arms or strategic defense deals, or even then just to shake the international strategic defense structure up?
China and Russia would certainly like to.
Yeah?
Yeah.
But you don't see them making any big moves right now.
Well, it's too early to tell, I think. I think, yeah.
I think
fair enough. The stance right now is that there's a vacuum, but nobody's really moving into it. Or there may yet be a vacuum, but nobody's moving into any extant vacuum.
Oh, I think China's definitely making a push, at least on the economic side. Their whole, I guess, new Silk Road idea, where they're building all these sea lanes and land passages throughout Asia, and they're trying to get them into Europe. I think is going to be hugely consequential. I think China's going to be a big player. I think, while Russia would like to be a bigger player, I think they're far too antagonistic to receive wide enough support from the people they would need it from in order to become the power they would like.
All right. Well, we're running out of time here, but before we wrap up, I just want to remind everybody that This is a podcasting network of William and Mary show. You've been listening to Talking TWAMPs, a show about politics and just our own personal opinions, which do not necessarily represent the opinions of the college or its administration, just those who have been speaking on this show, though I'd like to say they were pretty measured. And please, if you have enjoyed this, take a look at the podcasting network and the other podcasts that we offer. There's a wide range of them, and I hope you find something that you like. All right, panel. One final question for everybody to go around. Let's do the order that we introduced ourselves. Ukraine, in or out?
In what?
NATO.
In NATO. They've been petitioning for a little while.
Oh.
That's why I want Joe to go last. Abe?
I think they could be in. The question is, they have so much tension with Russia. Would that be beneficial to NATO? And
good cue.
Yeah.
All right. So, William, in or out?
I want Ukraine in. Russia's an antagonistic neighbor, and by not making by forming an alliance against it, I think it signals pretty hard we don't approve of Russia's actions. And despite what the president says, Russia, in my opinion, is distinctly not our friend and needs to be treated as such.
All right. Joe, our Ukrainian friend, in or out?
They would love to be in. I would love them to be in, but they won't be in because the Europeans are feckless centrists and are not going to tie themselves to Ukraine's territorial integrity. Accepting Ukraine into NATO would functionally mean making it that Russia occupies NATO territory, which is basically like Insta Article 5, right?
Right.
Yeah. And while it would probably be the best for everybody to try and deter Russia in a serious way like that, the Germans don't have the stomach for it. So it's not going to happen.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening, and hope you have the good rest of your day. Bye.
Au revoir.